This is another favorite of mine. This your mother would tie on you at night, so if you had an erection, you'd instantly stab the erection and it would subside from the pain. Pretty cool, huh? Except here's the problem for all of you to consider. All men in utero, before they're born and to the end of their days, have 3 or 4 erections at night during the deepest part of their sleep. It's a natural part of the vascular system and the relaxation system that's involved. So how these old Victorian docs explained to themselves that they were having this problem at night and the spikes weren't working is a mystery to me. And if you think about it, if the spikes did work, you'd never have any deep sleep. You'd be forever awake. Because every time you nodded off and started to, you know, what's the word, tumesce? Started to tumesce, then you'd get stabbed. Here's a more humane version of the same device. Upgrade, this is the upgrade. There's a band on the inside so that it doesn't stab you all the time, just when you press the bands in toward the spikes and then the spikes appear. This is another one. This is starts a phonograph. It senses that you're swelling up, starts a phonograph, and alerts the sleeper to impending danger. And I submit to you that if this notion were still alive, somebody would invent an iPhone app. That would do the same thing. That's for real. These are all patented devices that were available in the marketplace in America in the era between 1870 to the 1930s. Yeah, well, we weren't alone. Right, so here's some basic anatomy, and this is great stuff, but it's not part of any medical training. I have a niece who's a medical student at the University of Washington, and she says we learn nothing about male anatomy and innervation at all in class. So that little pokey thing you see at the end of this statue, it's an old Greco-Roman statue, is called the acropostheon. It was much prized by the Greeks and the Romans as a beauty mark for males. It meant you had an abundant and long and well-covered foreskin. Because in that era, you could be naked in public, but you were not allowed to show the end of your penis, which was considered sexually provocative. So if you had a good covering for it, you were protected from any claims that you were being obscene. So it's considered a beauty aspect. So Anglophone medical training has completely lost the knowledge of that in the Renaissance. And 67% of US medical books do not even depict a normal, natural penis. Imagine that, 67% of the medical books. So Avery's neonatology, which I quote on a regular basis, has an excuse for the modern ignorance. Because circumcision is so common in the United States, the natural history of the preputial, that is the foreskin, development has been lost, and one must depend on observations made in countries in which circumcision is not practiced. So I don't know if that's a good reason or a bad reason, but I can tell you this. In 1981, there was a published survey by the American Academy of Pediatrics which said 78% of pediatricians did not understand infant hygiene for intact boys. They gave bad advice. 2006, I had some colleagues take a survey at the annual meeting of the American Academy of Family Practice Docs. Of the 113 surveyed, three of them correctly understood the anatomy of an infant boy. In 2012, the American Academy of Pediatrics, in one of their more wonderful blunders, published a final report on circumcision that they'd been working on for decades. It said, the non-circumcised penis should be washed with soap and water. Bzzzt. You don't use soap on an infant's penis, especially not on the inside. Most adhesions present at birth, resolve by age 2 to 4 months. Well, those adhesions are not adhesions in the sense of a surgical adhesion that needs to be lysed or cut open. It's a natural membrane that's part of the boy's normal anatomy. It takes about 10 years to dissipate. So even if they argued that this was a typo and they meant to put 2 to 4 years and instead accidentally typed months, it's wrong by a decade. The foreskin is fused to the glands by a protective membrane, very much like, it can be thought of as the male hymen. And indeed, it's very easy to imagine a culture in which the appearance of the boy's glands at long last would be sort of a village celebration of some sort. You'd give him a present, treat him to dinner, whatever you would do. I mean, it hasn't happened. I mean, even in primitive cultures, I think girls' menses are celebrated, their first menses, but not the appearance of the glands. But never mind. Here's somebody showing how well attached the foreskin is to the end of the penis normally. So this is the correct way to do it. He should have, or she should have, gloves on, unfortunately. But you can see here how tightly bound it is. That's normal. It's protective. It's part of the normal protective mechanism for this structure. Unfortunately, most medical professionals rip it back because they think that somehow you need to see the end of the penis, and that's a horrible injury. And I can show you what happens because I handle 100 of them a year. This is what happens when you forcibly retract an intact boy before that membrane is ready to dissipate on its own. Very painful. That boy was left, I remember that case, he was left paraphimotic. When the parents took him back to the doctor, he said, oh, he's got an infection, it's your fault. And I mean, the cases are awful. What the foreskin is really doing is protecting itself because it's the erogenous part of the male. It's stored face down on the glands in a moist, warm area that's free from mechanical abrasion and any of the kinds of things I guess that could happen. The glands is actually more of a storage device, and it's not well known, but the glands the pointy fireman's hat at the end of a boy's penis is basically very insensitive. I mean, it has not much more sensitivity than the back of your hand or an earlobe. It's only erotic at its corona, at the edge. So it's an internal organ of the body. It's meant to stay covered, there's no doubt about it. But it was the precise target of people like John Harvey Kellogg and Louis Sayre because they knew that it was highly sensitive, and if you goofed with it, you'd get tuberculosis or something, or go blind, or lose your hair, or grow hair on your palm, something like that. So here's how it works. It's real simple. Though that Taylor's ridged band, as it's called, and that's named after a very famous, at least to me and those I work with, pathologist named John R. Taylor who lives in Winnipeg. He's now dead. He died a couple years ago. And I was proud to say that I think we exchanged emails sometime before he died. But it's actually the mucosal erogenous tissue of the male, which is, as you can see in the bottom illustration, it's exposed when it's needed and stored face down to be kept moist and protected when it's not. If you think about this, this is a pretty ingenious design. I mean, I'm not medically trained. I'm just a lawyer. But even I look at that and I think, admittedly, I was an engineer in the Merchant Marine, but so I can appreciate the engineering aspects of this. But it strikes me as a pretty amazing design that evolution has provided. I don't know why you'd want to tamper with it. So here's the results. If you circumcise a male, there's a natural male there on the left, you'll cut out all of the Taylor's ridge bands, the frenulum delta, as it's called. The frenulum is the line that kind of goes down the middle. It's the most sensitive part of the male. If you're lucky, you end up with a little bit of it. So the circumcised male has minimal erogenous tissue, a truncated frenulum, no ridged band. His proximal tissue, that is the tissue closest to his body, has been pulled out to be part of the working structure. And what was originally the working structure is now missing. Very hard for me to understand how an honest physician could possibly claim that this does not change male sexual function or male sexual pleasure. So, matter of fact, here's a better illustration of it. If you take a flaccid penis in the upper right-hand corner and mark the end with a marker, this is part of John Erickson's, another hero of mine, drawings of years ago. If you put a marker there and then also mark the corona and then pull the whole thing back, the outermost black line goes almost to the pubic hair, showing you how much tissue is really lost. It's as much as 15 square inches of tissue, 90 square centimeters for you Canadians. So gone is all the distal tissues, the nerves, the glands, the muscles, and the veins from the sulcus, that is the corona, to proximal to the line and beyond. This cannot be described as a little snip, which it often is on local websites. And here's the villain of the piece, in my opinion. That in 1934, the Gomco clamp was invented. Gomco stands for Goldberg Manufacturing Company. He and his auto mechanic made this, first one. And it industrialized circumcision because it turned it from a complicated procedure that you'd have to be a pretty good surgeon to do to an easy procedure that anybody could do. I could teach you how to use a Gomco clamp in 5 minutes, and you'd be quite at home with it at that point. It doesn't cut the tissue, it crushes it to goo, and then it's cut off, and with luck, the goo part grows together. It avoids tiny sutures, which are tough for somebody who's not an accomplished surgeon, and it provides hemostasis, that is, it limits bleeding if you're lucky. It has a very shallow bell, so it removes the maximum erogenous tissue. That was the entire point. And it's a microsurgery, but this is a macro tool. I mean, you're working on a structure that's only 3 centimeters, 1.5 inches long, right? So small, tiny, tiny errors in the use of this bell and the knife, etc., will create lumps and bumps and keratosis and weird scars that the man will have to look at for the rest of his life. Here's how it works technically. It actually makes me a little nauseous to see that, frankly. Here's another one that's commonly used. This is the Plastibell. You put it on a child's penis, you tightly tie this cord, so you strangle him over about a week. And at that point, the tissue simply dies because of lack of oxygen. This is tough stuff. So we still have lingering myths. The foreskin is vestigial. Sexual functions unchanged. Circumcision is painless. That's why we don't use any anesthesia. Infants don't remember trauma, but I'm sorry, they do. They just don't remember it in visual video form of the kind that we adults understand. They remember it as a deep wound of trust. They came out and all of a sudden were confronted with this painful procedure. So somewhere locked away, there is that memory. Circumcision prevents STDs? Well, right. All right. And he'll just need it later anyway, which is a very common myth I deal with constantly because it's used. People say, well, he has these adhesions. He's just going to need, he's going to need to be circumcised in 4 or 5 years. We better do it now. And that intact boys require demanding hygiene. Here's the truth. Intact boys and intact girls have exactly the same hygiene needs. Very little. Or none of us would be here. Doesn't it make sense that evolution provided you with a body that can deal with a certain amount of lack of hygiene? I mean, Americans shower every morning, which is a dreadful thing to do, actually, since it polishes off some of the necessary bacteria on your skin. But you can wash a child once a week, and you will probably have done them a favor. All right. A quick lesson on bioethics. Beneficence. These are the concepts. Beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, autonomy, and proportionality. Easily defined. Beneficence means you do things that are beneficial, right? Non-maleficence means you avoid harm or suffering if you possibly can. Justice, would you choose the procedure for yourself, seen from the outside. And autonomy is the person being treated as if they would have wishes of their own. And proportionality is what you're doing worth the risk and the pain and the potential losses. And this must always be viewed from the perspective of the patient. It cannot be viewed from the outside. You have to imagine yourself as the patient before you can apply them. I would say to you that circumcision, unfortunately, fails that test awfully. So that's the end of part one, and I've always loved this Greek probe. Sometimes people ask me why I do the work I do, and here's the answer from Greece. That country is good where old people plant trees whose shade they will never enjoy. Now, something about European developments. Norm especially asked that I do something about this. Well, the European situation has changed the whole game because what has happened is a large group of Muslim immigrants formerly confined to the Middle East has been migrating outward, both as refugees and economic refugees and fleeing from wars, etc., migrating to Western countries. They have brought with them their circumcision traditions, both male and female, which Northern European countries especially are unfamiliar with and intolerant of. Now, unfortunately, Europe, most countries in Europe, have a horrible tradition of anti-Semitism that goes back to the Middle Ages, largely cooked up by the Roman Church. And so they're rather reluctant to litigate or regulate a practice that they associate with the Jews whom they do not wish to offend. So this is a very problematic situation in Europe. These little Turkish boys, by the way, are being called prince for a day. They get paper hats and cardboard scepters, and they're herded down to the town square where barbers will operate on them with no anesthesia. If you look carefully at the photo, you'll see that the little boy with glasses in the lower right-hand corner has kind of figured out that this isn't going to go great. And that may be because he has been chatting with some of his slightly older brothers and cousins who had this done to them a year or two earlier. So, I mean, these are brutal, brutal, brutal traditions. I refuse to apologize for them. And I refuse to engage in sort of cultural relativism where I say, oh, well, it's just Turkey. It's their tradition, who am I to say? I'm here to say that I'm here to say. I was in Greece years ago, and I was reading the International Herald Tribune, which is a paper I always read overseas. And there was this brutal story in there of circumcision of 100 boys in Sofia, Bulgaria, in the town square, once again, with the barbers and the paper hats, and I was just nauseated. Several years ago in Cologne, Germany, a court faced with the case of a boy who had been seriously injured by a Muslim circumcision claimed that it was an assault and that the child had religious rights of his own. In other words, he could choose to be Muslim or Jewish or Christian or nothing, and that that was a right that he had. And that caused a tremendous uproar. And unfortunately, Germany is the worst possible place you can think of to begin campaigning against circumcision in a religious context. And you all know why, right? I mean, the German tradition, the German treatment of the Jews has sort of poisoned the well permanently for their being able to do anything. And the Bundestag passed by 435 votes to 100, a law that essentially allowed spiritual religious circumcisions. I think anesthesia is required, and an MD has to be on standby, and it's supposed to be done in a proper setting, but I have to tell you that law is being completely ignored. And now the people who pushed it, who are a weird combination of right-wingers who don't like immigrants and who think that what immigrants do is barbaric, and a left-wing tradition of humanist thinkers and people who are human rights activists. So they are themselves a strange bedfellows coalition on this issue. But now they're revisiting again the law as being way too permissive. I suspect it'll probably stay. Denmark, Finland, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, the Scandinavian countries. I never think of Greenland as a Scandinavian country. I think of this huge big white spot on the map. But it's Danish, of course, and it has its own government of sorts. But these are the ombudsmen for all those countries, and they sign an agreement that, and I'm going to quote from it, circumcision performed without a medical indication on a person who is incapable of giving consent violates fundamental medical ethical principles, not least because the procedure is irreversible, painful, and may cause serious complications. That's a quite bold statement, right? Yeah. Well, this is the European response to the AAP. The American Academy of Pediatrics in 2012, as I hinted earlier, issued a very thick document on circumcision, and the Europeans were quick to jump on it and say, oh, it's just, it's science biased by culture. So they replied to it, and that was published. But the European legal response was from the Council of Europe, their parliamentary assembly. They had a resolution about children's right to physical integrity, and immediately heard from Israel. It said, we certainly hope that you're not attempting to regulate circumcision, which is part of our spiritual traditions, and that would be anti-Semitic and would drive people away from their homelands if you did that. So they choked and said, well, we were just thinking about it. They did say a nice stuff, though. I'm particularly worried about female genital mutilation, the circumcision of young boys for religious reasons, early childhood medical interventions in the case of intersex children, and the submission to coercion of children into piercings, tattoos, or plastic surgery. And by the way, as to plastic surgery, how many of you know that there are teenage girls of 14, 15, 16 who are getting breast augmentation surgeries? And rhinoplasties, those things. I mean, I have to tell you that fundamentally doing surgeries on 18-year-olds or on 14, 15, 16-year-olds is crazy, because when what they look in the mirror, they see somebody who's really ugly and needs work. And so they're always going to ask for some crazy surgery if they can get their hands on it. It has to be resisted because they need to get to the age 18, 19, 20 when they'll be more content with themselves and less likely to demand some surgery. So Norway chokes. And this is terribly disappointing to me. I lived in a Norwegian house, Norwegian family's house when I was an undergraduate. And I still keep in close touch with them. And the fact that they signed that agreement, all the countries did, and Norway was the first to choke, is a personal disappointment for me. So Norway says, well, it's okay if there's an MD attending, and there must be some anesthesia, but what? And the boy should be consulted with the weight of his opinion based on age. Well, that means that if he's under 18, you can safely ignore him, or under 16. I think the Scandinavians are more liberal about that. That's likely to be, that's the situation as it is now legally. The Europeans raised the issue. It's unfamiliar to them. It's appalling to them. They've never had a tradition of medical circumcision in European countries. The only country with a tradition of medical circumcision anywhere near Europe is England, which abandoned it just after World War II. And so the situation there is that it's kind of in a holding pattern. We're hoping that some country, and I was hoping it would be Norway, would come out affirmatively and ban circumcision outright, saying, sorry, the child has his own religious beliefs. I mean, he's entitled to his own beliefs, even nothing. You do not have a right to inflict your religion on a child, and you do not have a right to do this in septic settings and basements and front parlors, etc. So we'll see. It's a hot issue. I get my share of hate mail. I'm sure some of you have had some of that too in your life. It's a tough issue, but it's worth fighting for. I should remind you that I also get involved, and I gave a speech, but I don't have enough time here to do it, but I gave a speech at Berkeley, University of California, several years ago about children, misuse of children in religious settings. And of course, many of you will know Rita Swan and her efforts on behalf of Christian Science children who are denied blood transfusions and oncology care, et cetera. So Doc doesn't get involved in that as deeply as I would like, because I got plenty on my hands just with male circumcision in the medical setting, let alone to take on their religious community. But we've had numerous cases in Oregon and Washington. Here's an irony for you, two ironies actually. If you're a liberal state that likes to provide medical care for the poor, you probably are a high cut rate state because you provide subsidies for circumcision. So there's an irony. And the other irony is that if you're a liberal state with a liberal tradition and you tolerate fundamentalist Christian sects living in the woods and depriving their children of medical care, then you have that problem too, almost caused by your own liberality. So, that makes sense? Well, thank you. That's all I have. I mean, I could go on for another hour, but you would beg me not to.
Yep. Okay. With all this migration of Muslims from North Africa and from the Middle East into Europe, is female genital mutilation getting to be a real problem in Europe?
Answer, yes, in bold type and large print.
Yeah.
No question about it. It's illegal everywhere in Europe, but this impulse runs deep. They figure out ways to do it. I mean, heck, I'm in Seattle. We have a 12,000 strong East African community, mostly Muslim, and this is part of their tradition, and they claim it's religious. They know that they might lose their status as immigrants if they get caught. It is a U.S. felony, but it didn't used to be an extra legal U.S. felony. Do you all know the distinction? There's such a thing as a crime that's a crime only if committed on your soil. If it's committed by your citizen on someone else's soil, say Canada or Puerto Rico or whatever, that's a bad example, Bermuda, then it wouldn't be a crime. But you can make a crime extra legal. In other words, you can make it so it covers people as people, no matter where they are. So in the US, it was legal to take your Somali daughter to East Africa to have a local midwife, in quotes, cut her with a potsherd, and then bring her back to the States and call that a summer vacation. I'm sure the daughter would have a different name for it. But we've now made it illegal to do even that. In other words, if it can't be proven that you took your daughter out of the country to Eritrea or Ethiopia or Somalia, had her circumcised and brought her back, that too is still a U.S. felony. And Britain changed that as well. Is that the over-comprehensive answer to that very good question? Thanks, Norm.
John, thank you very much for that very informative talk. Really appreciate that.
Did it have enough whimsical moments to counteract the melancholy? That's always a question.
The question that I have is, in light of Robert Boston's talk this morning, can you explain how the Jews in Europe and in the United States use the freedom of religion defense to justify circumcision and the continuing stance that they have in light of all of these legal developments in Europe?
Well, you came in just under the beep. You're okay. You know, here's the thing. And I get this question all the time. People say, John, you're a lawyer. You know this issue. You've been doing this for years. Why don't you do something about it? Get out there, use that law. What about the laws on assault? What about mayhem? My George Denniston, I work for, he's a doc, a wonderful doc, but he's always sending me emails saying, John, this is mayhem. You've got to do something about this. And the fact of the matter is there's always a distance between what the law says and what people are willing to do about it when you think about speed limits. So in the US, you can make a very, very good argument that circumcising a Jewish boy in a dirty parlor with tools at hand, or even doing it with clean tools at the synagogue, etc., is maybe an assault on the child, but nobody's going to go there. No, I mean, you can make a legal argument. It's been made hundreds of times. There's tons of legal articles on the subject and how it must be surely illegal. But the culture tolerates it. No one wants to take the Jews on this issue, and no one's going to start indicting. Some of you may know I got involved in a very ugly case in Canada in April and got beat up badly. There was a physician there, who was also of Jewish moil, Orthodox, who was practicing a practice that's highly controversial even among Jews, of sucking on the penis to clean the wound, essentially. That was the original understanding of it historically. But of course we know that the mouth is not the cleanest part of the human body, and that's a great way to transmit germs like herpes, for instance. And There had been several children who died in Brooklyn because of this particular practice. Well, this doctor practiced a modified version of it with a little glass pipette to keep him, you know, he didn't actually have contact with the boy. But I claimed, and maybe I shouldn't have taken this case on, that he was still practicing medicine badly because he would have to uncover his bearded face and shed dander, et cetera, into the wound, and that even doing the pipette thing, he was doing the child a disservice, and I got my head handed to me on a platter for all the obvious reasons. Yeah, it was the they didn't want to hear about it. The other thing is it's Canada, where it's not in good taste to go to Canada and start talking about bad things in New York. It just doesn't work as an analogy. They consider themselves beyond that. So yeah, let's leave that melancholy topic alone. Is that okay, Norm, for an answer? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Whenever I do some internet debates about circumcision, I often get links to articles, sometimes from even Mayo Clinic, that somehow it's more beneficial or something. But is there a sense of accountability to Mayo Clinic or people who are actually publishing such ridiculous studies?
Well, are you a physician? Did you say when you say your clinic? Did I hear you right?
Mayo Clinic.
Oh, Mayo Clinic. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, I understand. Yeah. Well, I mean, the lawyers who work on this, and there's about 10 of us max, I think, maybe not even as many as 10, have long thought that the American Academy of Pediatrics is ripe for a suit because they keep recommending this procedure, but they forget to tell parents all the downside of it. And they don't know anything about the anatomy of that particular part of the body, at least as far as sexual pleasure goes. And so we think they are up for a suit against them, but nobody has the kind of money that would fund a gigantic lawsuit. And the American Academy of Pediatrics is as rich as Croesus, and would just bury us in fines and legal problems. So no one wants to really take them on. But the answer to your question is, yeah, there's some legal liability there, but it only will work if people believe that it's a bad thing. At the moment, most Americans believe that circumcision is healthier, cleaner, simpler for the parents, take care of the boy, traditional, he'll want to look like that, he'll want to look like that in the swimming pool, etc. So until we break through that barrier, nothing's going to happen.